Hi, welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Emily Harper always believed true love was about partnership, presence, and building something together. But at 45, married for just over 3 years to Daniel Foster, she felt more like a guest in her own life than someone's wife. Daniel was a decent man, hard-working, polite, responsible. But he didn't talk much, got involved even less, and seemed emotionally miles away, even when sitting at the same table. He was the kind of man who followed through on his duties with precision, but never let himself feel too much. Everything about him was measured, rule-bound, scheduled, committed. That included how he treated his wife. When they got married, Daniel made it clear his son, Ethan, who was 18 at the time, still lived with him and didn't plan on leaving anytime soon. Emily didn't object. She thought she could handle it. She was in love and believed time would sort everything out. But what she found in that house was something she wasn't ready to face. Ethan was polite. He'd say hello, help with small things when his dad was around. But when they were alone, the atmosphere changed. He wasn't aggressive, but he wasn't just a shy kid either. There was something in his eyes, a way of looking at her that went beyond curiosity, and it made her uncomfortable. In the first few months, Emily tried to explain it all with empathy. She thought maybe Ethan had a hard time accepting a stepmother, that he missed his mom, that he was just a confused kid dealing with a new woman in his father's life. But time passed, and the looks didn't stop. It wasn't doubt or resistance anymore. It was provocation. Something quiet but there in every lingering stare, every sideways comment. She avoided thinking about it, especially since Daniel never seemed to notice anything unusual. To him, Ethan was just a young man who needed time, a little discipline, and a stable routine. Emily started feeling alone inside that house. Daniel left early, came home late, and hardly ever asked how she was doing. Dinners were silent. Conversations were limited to practical matters. It was as if she'd been hired to fill a role, the wife, and not to share a life. Her attempts to get closer failed one after another. He always seemed tired, distracted, like his mind was somewhere else. When she touched him, he pulled back almost automatically. They slept in the same bed but didn't reach for each other. They shared a roof but not their feelings. In the middle of all this, Ethan turned 21 and stayed right where he was, like nothing could move him. He wasn't studying, wasn't working, and didn't show any interest in moving out. He said he was still figuring out what he wanted from life. Daniel, frustrated by this inertia, ended up accepting it. Sometimes he'd talk to his son about plans, push him to take initiative, but he always gave in. Emily felt trapped in a house where nothing ever fully happened. Not affection, not conflict, just an endless wait for something that never came. And in the middle of it all, Ethan kept watching, growing more relaxed, more confident in the space he occupied. Over time, Emily began to miss herself. She started going to the gym more, not just for her body, but because at least there she saw living people. She talked to receptionists, other women working out, and smile at strangers. One day, while on the treadmill, a man came over and started chatting. He was friendly, polite, with a natural ease that stood in stark contrast to everything she lived at home. His name was Lucas. He mentioned the show she was watching on the treadmill screen, and that was enough to start a light, easy conversation, almost therapeutic. In the days that followed, they exchanged greetings, smiles, then longer talks. Nothing serious, but for someone emotionally starved, a simple gesture could feel like a feast. Lucas complimented her workout choices, said she seemed determined. Slowly, he started showing interest. One day, he suggested they grab coffee after their workout. She said no. The next time, she thought about saying yes. The third time, she did. She sat with him at a quiet cafe, and they talked for nearly 2 hours. She told him about books, trips she'd never taken, dreams she'd put aside. Lucas listened like he really cared. He was someone who, unlike Daniel, actually seemed present. She felt alive, and that was dangerous. The following week, they met up again. He was more direct this time, said he thought she was beautiful, that he couldn't understand how a man could ignore a woman like her. Emily laughed, flustered, but it got to her. It wasn't just the compliment that shook her. It was the fact that someone had truly seen her, not as someone's wife, not as a stepmom, not as a shadow of herself. In that moment, she was just Emily. And that was enough that a few days later, after lunch together, she agreed to go with Lucas to a hotel. She stayed with him a short while, long enough to feel something she hadn't felt in a long time. Desire, reciprocity, presence. Then she left, carrying guilt, shame, and a piece of herself she'd rediscovered, even if it was in the wrong way. She came home, took off her clothes, took a shower, threw the dress into the laundry basket, and tried to act like nothing had happened. She made dinner, set the table, said goodnight to her husband, who barely looked at her, and went to bed trying to convince her own heart it wouldn't happen again. What Emily didn't know yet was that someone had been paying attention to her every move. Someone who'd been watching her in silence for years and who now had what he needed to change the game. Ethan had been at a friend's house that afternoon, playing video games in the front room. The window faced the parking lot of a small, discreet hotel, the kind of place nobody really noticed. While his friend adjusted the game settings, Ethan went to the window, distracted, sipping a soda, when he saw a car he recognized immediately. It was Emily's car. He stood still for a few seconds, watching. She got out with determined steps, wearing a dress he'd never seen before. A man followed right behind, opened the door for her, and they both walked into the hotel. Ethan's heart raced. He stepped back from the window like he didn't want to see, but went right back. He confirmed what he'd just witnessed. He sat on the edge of the bed, not hearing a word his friend was saying. He tried to make sense of it, but the images spoke for themselves. He knew Emily had said she was going to the gym like she did every week. He also knew that neighborhood wasn't on the way back home. So what was she doing there at that hotel with another man? Ethan stayed at his friend's house for another hour, but didn't play anymore. His mind was elsewhere, creating scenes, dialogues, possibilities. It affected him in a way he couldn't explain. The image of Emily crossing the sidewalk with that other man kept replaying in his head like an uncontrollable loop. It was like something inside him had shifted. He'd thought about her before, imagined things he shouldn't have. But this was different. This was real, and now he held a card that changed everything. When he got home that night, Emily was in the kitchen making something simple. She acted normally, like it had been just another day. She greeted Ethan casually, like always, but he only responded with a long, sunk stare. He didn't say what he knew. He didn't ask anything. He just sat at the table, watching her movements with more attention than ever. She seemed too calm, and that poisoned him inside. The following days were filled with heavy slents. Ethan pretended everything was normal, but his mind was constantly working. He started tracking her schedule, her workouts, her routes. He looked for patterns, mistakes, traces. He found out the man's name was Lucas, caught sight of messages on her phone as he passed by, and slowly pieced it all together. He felt angry, but it wasn't regular anger. It was resentment mixed with something more personal, darker, like he'd been betrayed from a place that wasn't even his. One Saturday morning, Emily was alone in the living room watching TV when he sat down beside her. They sat in silence for a few minutes. Then he casually mentioned he'd seen a car just like hers parked near the hotel. She shifted in her seat, straightened her posture. He gave a faint smile, eyes still on the screen, and added that he'd seen that exact car in the parking lot in front of his friend's house and saw who got out with her. The silence between them grew thick. She tried to change the subject, deflect, but he didn't let her. Ethan said he understood that his father was distant, cold, and anyone in her place would have done the same. He spoke in a tone that mixed sympathy with implication. Then he looked at her and said he wouldn't tell Daniel, that he could keep it to himself as long as she did something for him. The words were casual, but the meaning was clear. Emily's eyes widened. Her face went pale. She asked what he meant by that. He leaned back on the couch, gave a faintly cynical smile, and said he just wanted what she'd already given to someone else. He said it outright. There was no misunderstanding. She stood up immediately. Her voice cracked the first time she tried to respond, but then she managed to say it was sick, that he was crossing a dangerous line. Ethan wasn't intimidated. He said she could be as offended as she wanted, but he knew everything. And one word from him could destroy her marriage. She could pretend outrage all she liked, but she knew what was at stake. Emily left the room without another word. She locked herself in her bedroom and cried silently. Her heart pounded out of control. This was a real threat inside her own home. The betrayal she already carried as guilt was now being used as a weapon against her. And the worst part was that no one would ever believe her version. Who would buy a story like that? A resentful kid trying to take advantage of his stepmother? Who would hear that without thinking it was just a desperate excuse to save her own skin? Ethan kept acting like nothing had happened. He smiled in front of his dad, helped set the table, joined conversations like always. But now there was a game in motion, and he knew he had the upper hand. Emily walked around tense, her eyes red, her face worn down. Daniel didn't notice. He stayed buried in his own world, fulfilling obligations, treating his wife with mechanical politeness and his son with the same usual indifference. Inside that house, two worlds were about to collide. And only one of them knew the fall was inevitable. The other was still trying to hold everything together, like it was possible to stop an earthquake with bare hands. But some cracks don't close. They grow in silence, fed by what stays hidden, and that house was already shaking from the inside. Daniel was sitting at the table with a folder of documents open when Ethan walked into the kitchen and said he needed to talk. His voice carried a practiced weight, a tone carefully balanced between concern and urgency. Daniel looked up, suspicious. Ethan said he'd found out something serious about Emily and thought his dad deserved to know. Daniel placed his hands on the table and stared at his son in silence. Ethan started slowly, like he hesitated to reveal something delicate, but gradually opened up. He said he'd seen his stepmother with another man, that he'd witnessed a meeting at a hotel. He gave the name of the place, described the man, mentioned the date. It was all true. He left out the blackmail attempt. He completely erased his own role in the story. Daniel listened without interrupting. His expression changed gradually from skepticism to disbelief, then to contained anger. Ethan finished by saying he didn't want to get involved, but thought it would be dishonest to keep it quiet. That he knew how much his dad trusted Emily, and that he himself had been shaken by what he saw. He made sure to sound hurt, like he was the victim of a moral betrayal. That night, Daniel didn't sleep. He sat on the living room couch for hours, motionless. His mind raced. He wasn't a man of impulsive actions, but something inside him had collapsed. In the morning, when Emily came downstairs for coffee, he was still there. His eyes were sunken, his face stiff. She was startled by the look in his eyes. She asked if everything was okay. Daniel responded with a sharp question. Who was Lucas? Emily froze. She didn't answer right away. Her throat tightened. She tried to form an explanation, but the only thing that came out was the name in a whisper. Daniel demanded details, wanted to know where, when, why. She took a deep breath and decided to tell the truth. She said she met Lucas at the gym, that they'd gone out a few times, felt a connection, and there had been one encounter. She admitted her mistake, took responsibility, didn't try to justify herself. Daniel listened without looking away. When she finished, he asked if there was anything else. She hesitated for a second, thought about staying quiet, but something inside her begged for justice. So she told him what Ethan had done. She said he'd approached her days later, tried to use her, offered a deal in exchange for silence. She spoke clearly, but her body trembled. Daniel slowly stood up, walked to the stairs, and called his son. Ethan came down relaxed with his usual calm expression. When he saw his father and Emily in the living room, he realized something had changed. Daniel looked him in the eye and asked if it was true. Ethan faked surprise, said it was absurd, denied it firmly, said his stepmother was making it up to defend herself, that it was a desperate move to shift focus from her betrayal. Daniel asked him to swear with conviction that it never happened. Ethan repeated it even more firmly, said he'd never do something so dirty, that he was disappointed his father would even consider it possible. Emily stood up, pointed at him, and said she remembered every word he'd said that afternoon. She said Ethan had looked her in the eye and made the offer without a shred of shame. Ethan's face hardened. For a moment he lost control and let a look of pure hatred slip through. It was enough. Daniel saw what he needed to see. He realized his son was lying. The truth was there in the silence that followed, in the quickened breath, in the way he looked away. Daniel told both of them to leave the house, said he didn't trust either of them anymore, that their presence there was unbearable. Emily tried to explain, said she'd been blackmailed, that she was trying to rebuild the marriage, that she'd told the truth to make things right. Daniel didn't respond. He just pointed to the door and said it was too late, that his trust had been shattered. It wasn't just about betrayal. It was about manipulation. Seeing his own son try to use someone else's suffering as leverage, and having a wife who'd hidden all of it for days. Ethan went upstairs, grabbed a backpack, and left without a word. He walked through the living room, eyes locked on his father, waiting for a reaction. Daniel stayed still. Emily, in tears, asked if he could at least hear her out. Daniel said nothing she could say would change the fact that it all happened under his roof. And he was the last to know. He said if she'd told him everything from the start, maybe there'd still be a chance. But now he didn't want to deal with it anymore. Emily left with shaking hands, her bag over her shoulder, eyes blurred with tears. She had nowhere to go. She rented a small apartment on the outskirts using the little she'd saved. She spent the following days in silence, thinking about how everything had collapsed so fast. Her marriage, her security, her trust, everything slipped through her fingers like wet sand. Daniel also pulled away from everything. He stopped answering co-workers, slowed down at work, locked his son's room, and avoided talking about it even with his own brothers. He said he needed time. No one understood what had happened, and maybe he couldn't explain it either. Emily knew she'd made a mistake. But inside her, there was something more painful than guilt. It was fear that even after everything, Ethan hadn't finished what he started. Because someone who does something like that once is capable of worse. And she felt his silence was only the beginning of something bigger. Daniel, on the other hand, tried to focus on moving forward, but the emptiness the two of them left behind in the house was impossible to ignore. One was his son, the other his wife, and both were now outside, carrying stories he'd never be able to forget. Time passed without making a sound. Emily woke up every day to a mix of exhaustion and swoons that filled every corner of the small apartment she'd rented. Nothing there was familiar, and maybe that was exactly what she needed. A space that didn't remind her of Daniel, that didn't carry Ethan's shadows, that didn't echo unfinished conversations. The first few weeks were heavy. Everything hurt. Her body, her mind, her pride. But what hurt most was the feeling of being reduced to a disposable memory. Daniel never called. No messages, no questions, no openings. Emily thought about writing, about trying one last conversation, but her pride stopped her. He'd made his choice, and she had to learn to live with it. The betrayal happened, and she acknowledged it. It was a mistake, a detour, an escape from herself. But the whole story wasn't just that. There was more behind it. She carried that truth with the same weight as her guilt, and she didn't always know which hurt more. During mornings, she tried to keep her mind busy with work. She took extra shifts at the clinic where she worked as a receptionist. In the afternoons, she cleaned the apartment, organized things, washed clothes that weren't even dirty. At night, she tried not to think, but it was impossible to ignore the messages. Ethan never completely disappeared. Sometimes he left vague comments on old social media posts. Other times, he sent cryptic messages from unknown numbers. Nothing explicit, nothing concrete enough to be a formal threat, but all with that same provocative tone as before, like he was saying, "I'm still here." She even went to the police station for advice. But without proof, without names, without anything solid, there was nothing they could do. The recommendation was simple: block him, distance yourself, ignore it. And that's what she tried. She changed her number, deleted her social media, altered her routes and routines. Emily spent her first few weeks in the new apartment in constant alert. She barely slept, left the lights on, and any noise in the hallway made her body tense up. She tried to stick to a routine. Wake up, have coffee, go to the market, come home, turn on the TV to fill the silence, but everything felt fragile, even her own thoughts. What had happened in that house affected her in a way she couldn't explain. She carried guilt over the affair, pain over being cast out, but what consumed her most was fear, and that fear had a name. Ethan. The first strange thing happened at the market. She was in line at the register when she noticed a man in a hoodie pointing his phone camera at her. When she looked directly at him, he lowered the phone and walked away without buying anything. A few days later, she found a yellow rose left on her apartment door handle. She thought it might be a coincidence, a neighbor's prank. But something inside her said it was different. The third incident was the clearest. When she arrived at her building, she saw a car parked across the street. The darkened windows hid the driver, but as soon as she approached the entrance, the car sped away. She went to the police station and filed a report. She described the incidents, mentioned Ethan's name, and shared part of the story. The officer on duty advised her to stay alert and come back if anything more concrete happened. Emily left with a mix of relief and helplessness. She was doing what she could, but it wasn't enough to guarantee peace. She started avoiding going out at night. She carried her phone in her hand, emergency apps open, contacts ready. She changed her door lock, added a double bolt, and installed a camera in the hallway. Still, fear kept living with her. One night, around 2 in the morning, she heard a metallic sound coming from the kitchen window. Her heart raced. She walked to the living room without turning on the lights and, through a gap in the curtain, saw a silhouette outside trying to force the window open. She grabbed her phone and called the police, whispering what she saw. The next few minutes felt endless. The man outside seemed determined, using something in his hand to pick the lock, trying not to make noise. When the police arrived, he ran, but officers caught him on the sidewalk. Emily only saw from a distance when one of the cops held the man, and it was Ethan. She collapsed, fell to the floor, and cried like she hadn't in a long time. It wasn't just fear. It was confirmation that what she'd felt wasn't paranoia. It was real. He was there. He'd come back, and he'd crossed every possible line. The next day, the police called Emily to the station. They said they'd searched Ethan's apartment, and what they found shocked even the most experienced officers. One wall was covered in photos of her, taken in public places from a distance. Some were old, probably copied from social media, but the most disturbing part was the collages, pictures of her pasted next to Ethan in couple-like situations. Hearts drawn in red marker, fake dates, phrases like "our night" and "forever." There was even a fake wedding scene, her dressed as a bride, him in a suit cut from other photos and placed together in front of a church. The investigators said this showed a severe fixation. The prosecution requested pre-trial detention based on the clear risk to the victim's physical and psychological safety. Emily was advised to seek therapy, change her address, and keep her routine completely private. She followed all of it. She quit her job, ended her lease, blocked all old contacts, and disappeared from the city in less than a week. She chose a distant state, rented a simple place, and started rebuilding her life with what little she had. There she started using a middle name, stayed off social media, and avoided any kind of exposure. The beginning was hard. Trusting strangers seemed impossible. Answering the phone, opening the door, leaving the house, everything took an enormous effort. But slowly, with help from a local therapist, she started breathing a little easier. She got a job as an administrative assistant at a school, made quiet new friendships, and attended support groups for stalking victims. It was like relearning how to exist. Ethan remained in custody. During the hearings, his defense claimed psychological disorder, saying he'd been emotionally unstable since his parents' separation. But the evidence, the reports, the attempted break-in were too strong to reduce the sentence. He was transferred to a psychiatric unit with constant supervision and mandatory treatment. Visits were restricted. Daniel never showed up. Emily kept moving forward, but she carried invisible scars. She felt relief being far away, but she also knew this wasn't just a bad memory. It was a brutal lesson about how danger can grow in silence, disguised as routine. She wondered how she hadn't seen it sooner, how she'd missed the signs. But she wasn't looking for answers anymore. She just kept going. She knew that despite everything, she still deserved a decent life. And she held on to that right with every bit of strength she had left. Because some pains never go away. They just move somewhere else and turn into the courage of someone who survived. In the heart-wrenching tale of Emily Harper, we uncover a profound life lesson. The silent dangers that lurk in unchecked emotions and unspoken truths can shatter lives. But true strength lies in reclaiming one's voice and trusting your instincts. Emily's journey, from a loveless marriage where she felt invisible, to the chilling betrayal by her stepson Ethan, whose obsession escalated into stalking and terror, reminds us that ignoring red flags like lingering stares or emotional distance can lead to unimaginable pain. Yet it's her resilience that inspires most. Rising from the ashes of guilt, fear, and isolation, she rebuilt her life far away, seeking therapy, forming new bonds, and embracing survival as her greatest victory. This story teaches us that vulnerability isn't weakness. It's the catalyst for courage. In a world where threats often hide behind familiar face, we must listen to our inner warnings, communicate openly in relationships, and never underestimate our capacity to heal. Emily's scars became her armor, proving that even in darkness we can find the light within. What lessons have you learned from betrayal or obsession? Share your emotional stories in the comments below. I'd love to hear them. And if this touched your heart, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications for more gripping, real-life tales that move and motivate. Let's build a community of survivors together.